Hi, it's Dr. Mark Woodall from Cascade Integrative Medicine, and today I'd like to share with you my thoughts and some information on the red meat, media, and cancer study that just came out from the World Health Organization. So first I'd like to declare my biases. My bias is that I eat grass-fed beef. I love it. I think it's nutritious. I feel strong off it, and I also eat pasture-raised pork and bacon. The press release came out this Monday about the World Health Organization. You might have heard it on New York Times. You might have heard it on Washington Post. It was all over the internet that red meat, processed meat, give you cancer. Processed meat is worse for cancer risk than red meat is, but they both were linked and classified by the World Health Organization. Red meat is beef, veal, pork, lamb, mutton, horse, and goat, where processed meat is anything like bacon, salami. If it was salted, cured, smoked, preserved, that's the difference. Okay, so let's dig in a little bit. If you haven't seen Examine.com's article on this, I highly recommend you go to Examine.com, check out their blog post on red meat and colon cancer, etc. And one of their statements is really, I thought, profound, and I'd open up with this. So just because an organization publishes their expert opinion based off of the evidence does not mean that those guidelines are necessarily totally correct. Perfect example of this, as they point out in this paper here, is that the World Health Organization's guidelines on salt still advocate for salt restriction, even though the CDC in the United States has updated their guidelines because of a lack of evidence and possible harm. This was the paper that was published in the Lancet Oncology journal. It was published online. The actual study has not been published yet, but basically 22 scientists got around and they looked over about 800 different epidemiological, in vitro, all kinds of different research studies. This is only a 1.5 page summary, so it only highlights a few of the things, and that's where I'll primarily be taking most of my data from. So to recap, Group 1 was the classification which causes cancer according to the World Health Organization, and that was designated for bacon, sausages, hot dogs, salami, things like preserved and smoked meats. Pork, beef, and lamb were not given Class 1 classification. They were given Group 2A, probably causes cancer. So there's a bit of a difference, and we'll talk about what they put in their summary paper. In their summary paper, they said that colon cancer is a big deal, and there's a strong connection with it and meat consumption. So colon cancer is the third most common cancer, and it also is the third cause of cancer-related deaths in America. So it's kind of a big deal. And with this meta-analysis that they reference in their paper, they said that there's a 17% increased risk per every quarter pound of beef that you're basically consuming. No one really knows what a 17% increased risk means. That sounds kind of scary. Well, let's do an example. Let's say that you have a baseline risk of 5%. Now, this is an arbitrary number. We don't actually know what your baseline colon cancer risk is. But if it was 5% and you were to eat a quarter pound of beef consistently, your risk would be at 5.85%. Now contrast this to the connection between smoking and lung cancer, which almost has a risk of almost 11-fold increased risk of lung cancer. What that means is if you had a 5% chance of getting lung cancer baseline risk before smoking, and then you started smoking for most of your life, your risk of lung cancer has now increased from 5% to 55%. So you can see the difference between less than a 1% increased risk with the red meat consumption as being a variable, and cancer, lung cancer, and smoking as the variable. Other risk factors that are associated with colon cancer include obesity, BMI, sedentary lifestyle, diabetes, smoking. Here's the interesting one though. Alcohol. 2 drinks a day gives a relative risk of 1.16. That's interesting because it's almost the identical number, 1.17, as red meat. And yet we don't hear the media and Twitter blowing up that's saying, oh my god, alcohol, red meat, colon cancer. We all hear about red meat. Now red meat, I don't like to make this dichotomy, but for simplicity I'm going to break it down for lay people and say there's good things to it and bad things about it. Protein, it's a great source of protein. Iron. Lots of my female patients are iron deficient, and I've already talked at length about fighting fatigue in my video series. Zinc, B12, other B vitamins. And here's the other thing. When we're talking about grass-fed beef, it's a high and good quality source of omega-3 fatty acids. Now, there can be nitroso compounds, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. You do not want to be ingesting charred black beef. It's a bad idea. Also, if you have too much iron, that can cause problems as well. And then there's this whole other idea about TMAO, and we'll talk about that. So looking back at the 17% increased risk in colon cancer, which had the strongest relationship to it, one of the things I found interesting was their statement here that said, and this is directly from their paper, chance, bias, and confounding could not be ruled out with the same degree of confidence for the data on red meat consumption, since no clear association was seen in several of the high-quality studies, and residual confounding from other diet and lifestyle risk is difficult to exclude. Let me say that one more time. No clear association was seen when we look at higher quality studies, and we can't forget about the fact that diets are not isolated things, they're holistic things. When you eat bacon, maybe you're eating Brussels sprouts. When you eat a burger, you're also maybe eating an avocado and tomatoes and all of these other whole foods. Lifestyle risk is also important. And let's see how that extrapolates from cancer to heart disease, because we have a lot more data on cardiovascular disease. Now, here's a paper that was published, Walter Willett's group in Harvard, Frank Hugh, some big names in nutrition, and they published a while about increased risk of total cardiovascular and cancer mortality, and that people should be using other protein sources. Interestingly enough, men and women with higher intakes of red meat were less likely to be physically active, more likely to be current smokers, to drink alcohol, and have a higher BMI. All of the things that potentially increase your risk of colon cancer. This is what we call the confounders. They travel with the data. Here's the data. The people who are in the current red meat low group, and then the high red meat quintiles. And you can see that smoking triples when you go from people who eat red meat almost never to people who eat it fairly frequently. Your alcohol consumption increases dramatically from people who rarely drink to people who are at least getting a drink or two a night. There are other confounders here. Here's another paper from Dariush Mozaffarian, a very prominent researcher, looking at red and processed meat and risk incidence of coronary heart disease and other things. And what they found was that higher consumption of red and processed meat tended to be similarly associated with smoking, higher body mass index, family history of diabetes, hypertension, higher education and an income level, and higher intake of total energy, meaning eating too many calories. It also is associated with less physical activity, multivitamin use, prevalence of high cholesterol, glycemic load, and intake of carbohydrates. These are all what we call the healthy user effect. It's basically where I like to think of it as the yoga teacher effect. You have your yoga teacher, and they kind of imbue and embody the model of health. They don't drink, they don't smoke, they exercise, they sweat, they eat their fruits and vegetables. They have happiness and joy in their life. And whether or not they eat meat or not doesn't seem to really be a huge player, because, again, it's not as big of a risk factor. We're going to continue on with maybe some of the mechanisms and how red meat might be harmful and potentially why we see this increased risk of cancer causing effects with red meat consumption and colon cancer in our next video. I'm Dr. Mark Woodall. I talked really fast. I hope you were able to keep up. Please replay that video, tweet it, share it with your friends on Facebook, and be well.